42 billionaires, one room, and a 20-year-old nobody just bought the most feared criminal empire in Korean history. In cash. Nobody knew his name, nobody knew where he came from. But when he stood up, pulled a faded photograph from his jacket pocket, and laid it on the table for every powerful man in that room to see, the silence that followed was the kind that precedes something irreversible. The photograph showed a pregnant black woman standing alone in the rain outside iron gates, her dress soaked through, her face turned away from the camera as if she already knew no one was coming for her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The woman in that photograph was my mother," he said. "And tonight, the empire that threw her out in the rain belongs to her son." If you want to know how a boy born from that kind of abandonment became the man who destroyed a mafia empire without firing a single shot, stay until the end. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The night Amara Adeyemi arrived in London, it was raining so hard the streetlights looked like they were bleeding. She was 22 years old, carrying one suitcase. A scholarship letter from King's College printed on paper she had read so many times, the fold lines had worn soft as cloth, and approximately 412 pounds in a bank account she had been adding to since she was 16. She stood outside Heathrow arrivals with her suitcase handle gripped in both hands and watched the city move around her. Taxis cutting through standing water, strangers walking with their heads down, the whole place roaring and indifferent, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear, not loneliness, relief. Lagos had been loud in a way that felt personal, like the city was always pressing on you, demanding something. London was loud too, but it was impersonal. No one here cared who her father was, what church her mother attended, whether she had passed her entrance exams the first time or the third. Here she was anonymous, and anonymity felt like the first real breath she had taken in years. She had been accepted into the pharmaceutical sciences program. Full scholarship, accommodation included. Her mother had cried. Her aunties had cooked for 3 days. Her father, a man who expressed pride through practical instruction rather than words, had sat her down the night before her flight and spent 40 minutes explaining how to identify a trustworthy taxi from an untrustworthy one in a foreign city. It was the most tenderness she had ever seen from him. She found the university accommodation on her own, navigating the tube with the focused intensity of someone who had studied the map for 2 weeks. She did not ask for help. She did not need it. That had always been her particular stubbornness, the refusal to appear lost even in the moments she was most lost. Her room was small. Her roommate was a biochemistry student from Manchester named Chloe, who talked constantly and left hair ties on every surface. The program was harder than she had anticipated and more interesting than she had hoped. She worked. She read. She made precise, careful notes in handwriting so small her study group teased her about it. She did not go out much in the first semester, not because the city intimidated her, but because she was tracking something, tracking her own capability, measuring it against the work, making sure she could do this before she let herself believe she could do this. She could. By her second year, her professor, a gray-haired Scotsman named Dr. Calloway, who had published more papers than some entire university departments, had begun citing her coursework during lectures. Not by name, just the ideas. But she knew which ones were hers, and knowing was enough. She met Tae-hyun in February of her second year, which she would later understand as the cruelest possible timing, late enough that she had built something worth losing, early enough that she had not yet learned to protect it. He was sitting in this back corner of a seminar on drug compound synthesis that he had no academic reason to attend. She noticed him because everyone else in the room was taking notes, and he was not. He was watching the professor with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who already know what is being taught. Not boredom, something more precise than boredom, like a chess player watching a game 3 moves ahead of where the other players thought they were. He was Korean, mid-20s, wearing clothes that were expensive without announcing themselves as expensive. The kind of thing you only recognized if you had grown up watching your mother assess fabric quality in the market before buying. He had a jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed in straight lines, and eyes that were doing something complicated when they finally moved from the professor to her. She looked away. She wrote something in her notebook that had nothing to do with drug compound synthesis. After the seminar, he stopped her in the hallway, not aggressively, just stepped into her path in a way that was technically an accident and technically wasn't. "You're not in this program," she said. "No," he agreed. "Then why are you in that seminar?" He considered this for a moment with a seriousness that she found immediately irritating and immediately interesting. "I was curious," he said, "about the subject." "That's what the internet is for." He smiled. It changed his face considerably. "I learn better from people than from screens." "You weren't taking notes." "I have a good memory." She studied him for a moment, the way she studied anything she wasn't sure about yet, with that measuring stillness that her mother called suspicious and her professors called analytical. "What do you actually study?" "Business," he said, and then with a self-awareness that was surprising enough to disarm her, "which is considerably less interesting than what you study." His name was Kang Tai-hyun. He told her he was a postgraduate business student. He told her he was from Seoul. He told her his family was in logistics and manufacturing. These things were all technically true, which is one of the more effective forms of lying. They did not date immediately. She was not the kind of woman who dated immediately. They talked. Over coffee first, then over meals, then over long walks through the city in the peculiar London weather that couldn't decide between rain and almost rain. He was curious about her work in a way that felt genuine rather than performative, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he had actually been listening, remembering details from previous conversations, pushing back on her ideas with an intelligence that made her sharper rather than defensive. And he was careful with her, careful in a way she hadn't experienced from men before, not hovering, not possessive, but attentive. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He learned quickly that she did not like being touched unexpectedly and adjusted without making it strange. When she worked late, he didn't complain. He showed up sometimes with food and left without requiring conversation. She fell in love with him the way she did most things, slowly, methodically, and then all at once, as if the slowness had just been preparation for the force of it. He told her he loved her in March of her 3rd year, standing in her kitchen at midnight while she was stress-eating crackers over her dissertation notes. She looked at him for a long time without saying anything, long enough that a less certain man would have started walking back the words. He just stood there and let the silence run, and that patience was what finally broke her.
"I love you too," she said, "but I need you to know I don't say things I don't mean. So I need you to not have said that unless you meant it."
"I meant it," he said. She believed him. That was not stupidity. That was evidence. She was a scientist. She went on evidence, and the evidence, every consistent, careful, present thing about him, pointed to a man who meant what he said. She was wrong, but she was wrong the way people are wrong when they're looking at incomplete data. The data she had was real. The data she didn't have would have changed everything. He never mentioned his father was dying. He never mentioned what his father ran. He never mentioned that back in Seoul, in a tower of black glass that housed the legitimate face of a criminal organization that stretched from construction to narcotics to government contracts. The man whose blood ran in his veins was making arrangements for succession, and that those arrangements included his eldest son returning home to take command. What he told her 6 months into the relationship was that he had walked away from his family's expectations, that he had chosen London specifically to put distance between himself and what his father wanted him to become. That business school was a compromise, something that kept the peace while he figured out how to build a life that was actually his. She understood that. She had her own version of it. Parents who loved you but wanted you to be a particular shape of person that wasn't quite the shape you actually were. She thought she understood what he was running from. She did not understand the scale of it. They were together 2 years before he told her the truth. By then they had moved into a flat together, her idea, practically speaking, because her scholarship housing was ending and splitting rent made financial sense, and she was not the kind of person who made major decisions for romantic reasons. But she knew what it meant. She had packed her books and her careful notes and her one good coat, and she had moved them into a shared space with another person, which was the most trust she knew how to show. He told her on a Sunday. She remembered that specifically because she had been making eggs and the pan had still been on when he started talking, and she had turned the burner off without thinking about it. And the eggs sat there getting cold while he dismantled every assumption she had built the last 2 years on. His family name was Kang, as in Kang Holdings, the conglomerate she had read about in international business news, The company that appeared legitimate on its surface and was understood by anyone who looked carefully to be something considerably darker underneath. His father was Kang Dai-won, who had spent 40 years building the most powerful criminal organization in South Korea through a combination of business acumen, strategic brutality, and the kind of political connections that made prosecution extremely difficult. And his father was dying. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. Amara stood there with a cold pan and a plate of eggs she was never going to eat, and looked at the man she loved and tried to find the lie in his face. She was good at reading people. She had always been good at reading people. What she saw was not a liar. What she saw was a man who had been lying to himself about whether he could keep the two halves of his life separate and had just run out of room to keep doing it. "You said you walked away from your family," she said. "I did. But they're still there." "Yes. And when your father dies, I don't know," he said, which was itself a kind of answer. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat down at the kitchen table and thought for a long time while he stood there and let her think. And that patience, that same patience she had loved, felt different now. Less like steadiness, more like someone who had practiced waiting for this particular storm. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. "Whatever we decide together," he said. She looked at him. "That's not an answer." "I know." "Then give me an answer." He crossed his arms, set his jaw, and she saw something she hadn't seen from him before. Not evasion, not softness, but a kind of wall. Not hostile, just there. "My father built something that employs thousands of people, that funds legitimate businesses, hospitals, universities. It's not clean. I know it's not clean, but it's not simple either. You're describing an organized crime network as infrastructure. I'm describing complexity. You're describing something you're not as finished with as you told me you were." The silence between them after that was different from all the silences before it. Less comfortable, more honest. She did not leave him. That decision came from a place in her that she couldn't fully explain and wouldn't have wanted to. The place where love and stubbornness had become indistinguishable from each other. But she set conditions, clear conditions, the way she said everything, precisely, without softness, leaving no room for later renegotiation. If he inherited, she would not be in Seoul. If he was going back to lead a criminal organization, he was going alone. If they were going to build a life, it was going to be a life. Not a performance of one in the shadow of something else. He agreed to all of it. She told herself that meant something. His father died in November. Tae-hyun flew to Seoul alone. He was gone for 2 weeks, then 3. She received calls that were shorter than they used to be, with pauses in places where before there had been words. She kept working. She submitted her dissertation. She waited. When he came back, he looked like a man who had put something down and picked up something else. The weight was different, distributed differently across his shoulders. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, precisely, clinically, and with a growing dread that she refused to let herself name. "I have to go back," he told her. "For how long?" "Amara Sitso." "For how long?" He looked at her across the flat they shared, across the bookshelves she had filled and the desk where she worked and the kitchen where he had learned she liked her coffee made a particular way, and his face did something complicated and unresolved. "I can't leave it, not right now. The organization is... There are people depending on what happens in the next 6 months. If I don't go back, everything my father built collapses. And when things like this collapse, people get hurt. People get hurt either way. Different people." She sat with that. "And what am I supposed to do?" "Come with me," he said. "Please." It was the please that got her. She had never heard him say it quite like that, stripped of everything else. No strategy or patience or careful management, just the bare ask of someone who needed something and was afraid to need it. She said yes. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would keep working, finish her postdoctoral applications from Seoul, maintain who she was inside whatever situation she was walking into. She told herself she knew what she was doing. She didn't know. But neither did he. And at that moment, in that flat in London, that shared not knowing felt like enough of a bond to hold them together. It was not. Seoul hit her the way cold water hits you when you aren't expecting it. Not just the temperature, but the force of it. The complete sensory reorientation. The Kang estate sat in the northern hills of the city, like a fortress that had learned to dress like a home. Enormous stone walls, immaculate gardens, staff who moved through the corridors with the particular soundlessness of people trained to be invisible. Everything was beautiful, and nothing was warm. Lady Kang, Taehyun's mother, a woman of 60 who wore her elegance like armor, received Amara in a sitting room that was larger than Amara's entire childhood apartment. She was polite. Precisely, technically polite. The kind of polite that communicates contempt more efficiently than insult. She poured tea. She asked about Amara's studies with an interest that was completely performative. She looked at Amara's hands, her face, the particular shade of her skin, with the contained expression of a woman who had strong opinions and the discipline not to express them in the first meeting. After she left, Taehyun asked Amara how it had gone. "She thinks I'm a mistake," Amara said. "She'll come around." "You sound very confident about something you have no evidence for." He didn't respond to that. The wall was back. The one she had first seen in the London kitchen, thicker now, more familiar to both of them. The weeks that followed were an education in a world she had no frame of reference for. The Kang household ran on a code of conduct that was never written down and never explained. She was expected to absorb it through proximity, to understand instinctively what she was supposed to wear, and where she was supposed to stand and which conversations she was supposed to participate in and which she was not. She failed these unwritten tests constantly. Not from stupidity, but from a principled refusal to learn rules she had never agreed to follow. Lady Kang began applying pressure in ways that were difficult to name. Nothing direct. Never a command. Just restructuring. Amara's schedule was quietly filled with appointments she hadn't requested. A stylist, a language tutor for a dialect of Korean that Amara already spoke but apparently not the right kind. A social calendar full of lunches with wives of men whose names she was told to memorize. Her research applications, the ones she had been working on, her actual work, kept encountering small administrative obstacles. Documents delayed. Contacts who had been responsive suddenly weren't. She pushed back. Every time firmly, without drama, the way she pushed back against anything. She had a conversation with Lady Kang that was technically calm and essentially a declaration of war. She told Taehyun what was happening. He listened. He said he would handle it. He did handle some of it. The stylist disappeared, the lunches became less frequent. But the administrative obstacles to her research remained, and there were new ones she couldn't trace back to anything. She started learning the shape of her cage. It was comfortable and well-appointed and surrounded by people who did not acknowledge it was a cage. That was the particular architecture of it. The one thing that made any of it bearable was him. The nights when they were alone, just the two of them in the private suite that was technically theirs and felt increasingly like it belonged to the house rather than to them, those hours were still real. He still knew how to be present with her, still asked about her work, still pushed back on her ideas, still had that quality of attention she had first noticed in a lecture hall in London. She held on to those hours and used them to convince herself that the rest of it was temporary, transitional, something they were passing through. She found out she was pregnant in the middle of all of it. She sat in the bathroom of the suite with the test in her hand and felt things she couldn't organize into sequence. Fear and joy arriving simultaneously, wrestling each other. The fear was practical. She could enumerate its components: the unstable situation, the hostile household, the growing distance between who she was and who this place was trying to make her, the man she loved who was pulling in a direction she couldn't always see. The joy was not practical. It was just there, immediate and unearned and enormous. She told Taehyun that evening. His face moved through something she watched carefully, the precise order of it. Surprise first, then something that looked like joy. Then, and this was the thing she tracked, the thing she turned over in her mind afterward, something else, something that moved through his eyes and was gone before she could name it. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Of course," he said. "That's not what I asked." He held her face in his hands, both of them, the way he did when he wanted her full attention, and told her he was happy. She believed it, partially. The scientific part of her noted the moment of hesitation, filed it, did not discard it, did not yet know what to do with it. She thought things would change. She thought the pregnancy would shift something in the household, in his mother, in the terrible architecture of obligation and expectation that had been pressing on both of them since they arrived. She told herself that a child, their child, would be the thing that made this place finally belong to her too. She had, in this, profoundly misjudged the situation. What she didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that 600 kilometers away in Busan, a woman named Seo Hye-rin was having a conversation with her own mother about the timeline of a plan that had been in motion long before Amara had ever set foot in Korea. Hye-rin was 28, the daughter of one of the most powerful criminal families on the peninsula, Tae-hyun's childhood fiancé, in the way that sons of powerful men had childhood fiancés, arranged, agreed upon, deferred but never dissolved. She was patient, intelligent, and had been watching the situation in the Kang household with the calm attention of someone who had decided a very long time ago how this story ended. She had not decided that it ended with Amara Adeyemi. Tae-hyun had told Amara that Hye-rin was the past. He had said it with the conviction of a man who meant it at the time he said it. He had not factored in the specific pressure of running a criminal empire, while two powerful families waited to see whether he would do what was expected or continue doing something they had collectively decided to tolerate only for so long. The first time Amara heard Hye-rin's name was at a dinner for 30 people in the estate's formal dining room, a dinner she had been told was routine, a regular gathering of business partners. Hye-rin arrived late, on purpose or as good as, in a white dress that was specifically not trying to be noticed and was succeeding in being noticed by everyone in the room. She greeted Lady Kang first, then the other guests, moving through the room with the ease of someone who had been there 1,000 times. She greeted Amara last. The pause before she reached her was deliberate. The smile was perfect. "You must be Amara," she said, in English, which was itself a small cruelty. The implication that she had accommodated, that Amara was the guest in need of accommodation. "Tae-hyun has spoken about you." "Has he?" Amara said. "Of course." The smile again. Warm, perfect, like something manufactured. "We've known each other our whole lives. It's wonderful that he found someone in London." Found someone. As if she were a thing he had picked up. A souvenir. Amara looked across the table at Tae-hyun. He was talking to someone else and not looking at her. She watched his profile for a moment. The jaw, the set of his shoulders, the specific way he was not turning his head in her direction, and felt the first clean pulse of something she didn't want to feel. She ate dinner. She was gracious. She did not cause a scene. She was not the kind of woman who caused scenes. She was the kind of woman who noted exactly what she had observed, cataloged it precisely, and waited until she was alone with the right person to speak about it. That conversation with Tae-hyun happened after midnight. She asked him directly about Hye-rin. He answered directly, which she gave him credit for, acknowledged the engagement, said it had been a family arrangement, said it was over, said his mother was the one who had extended the invitation tonight, and he hadn't known she was coming. She asked him if he was sure it was over. "Yes," he said. She looked at him in the way she had learned to look at him, past the surface, past the confidence, into the hesitation. There was no hesitation. She found none. And so she believed him again. She would later wonder about that moment, whether she had missed something, whether the hesitation had been there and she had been too tired, too far from herself, too deep inside the fortress to read him clearly, whether she had wanted to believe too much to see, or whether, at that exact moment, he had been telling the truth, whether the lie only became a lie later, built from pressure and family expectation and the specific kind of weakness that looks like strength from the outside. Whether some betrayals aren't decided in advance but accumulate the way damage does, gradually and then all at once. She didn't know. She would never fully know. That uncertainty was its own particular cruelty. The months that followed were the most disorienting of her life. The pregnancy made everything physical, the body asserting itself, demanding accommodation from the mind, from the schedules and the social obligations and the estate's relentless requirements. She was tired in a way that went past fatigue. She was emotionally thin in ways she couldn't afford to show because she had already learned that showing weakness in this household was information, and information was leverage, and she would not give Lady Kang leverage. She called her mother from a garden on the south side of the estate, where she had found a corner the staff didn't use, screened by old trees. She didn't tell her mother everything. She told her she was pregnant, and her mother cried, and they talked for an hour about small things, the aunties, the neighborhood, a cousin's wedding. She held the phone after the call ended and sat for a long time with the trees and the distance. She was holding the weight of things she couldn't put down and couldn't share and hadn't consented to carry. The thing she held most carefully, most privately, was the growing awareness, arriving slowly, then faster, that Taehyun was not just managing an empire, he was being managed by one. That the man she had loved in London, who had seemed to exist in relation only to her, had a whole other gravitational system pulling on him that she couldn't see clearly and could only measure by its effects. He was home later. He was more tired, a different kind of tired, with something corrosive in it. There were phone calls he stepped out of rooms to take. There were meetings she was not told about until after they happened. There were conversations between him and his mother that stopped when she entered a room. None of this was conclusive. She was a scientist. She didn't deal in feelings, she dealt in evidence. And the evidence, individually, could all be explained. The cumulative weight of it was harder to explain. The cumulative weight of it felt like a man slowly turning away from her, by degrees small enough to deny but consistent enough to track. She tracked them. She catalogued them. She held on to London in her memory like a fixed point, measured the distance between then and now, and kept the measurement to herself. She was 4 months pregnant when she overheard the conversation. She hadn't been listening for anything. She had come downstairs early in the morning. The pregnancy had disrupted her sleep, and she had developed a habit of walking the lower corridors in the pre-dawn quiet when the house felt briefly, accidentally, like it might be something other than what it was. She was passing the door of Taehyun's office, which was cracked open, when she heard his mother's voice. She stopped, not because she decided to listen, because her body stopped before her mind caught up. Lady Kang was speaking in Korean with the particular evenness of a woman not having a conversation but delivering a verdict. Amara didn't catch every word. Her Korean was functional, but the register was formal and fast. But she caught enough. The Seo family, the alliance, the child Haerin was carrying. She stood in the corridor and felt the information rearrange everything around it the way certain discoveries do. Not adding to what you know, but changing the structure of it. Reformatting it, making the previous version incomprehensible. She waited. She didn't burst in. She didn't run. She stood there until her hand stopped shaking, which took longer than she wanted it to, and then she went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall while Taehyun slept. She looked at him for a long time. She was still looking at him when the sun came up and he opened his eyes. He saw her face and knew. She watched the knowledge arrive in his expression, watched him try to find the shape of what she had learned, assess the damage, calculate the approach. She had always hated that quality in him, the strategizing, even now. "How long?" she said. He sat up slowly, said nothing for a moment, then, "Amara, how long has she been pregnant?" Another pause, the kind of pause that was its own answer. 3 months. She did the math. She was 4 months along. The arithmetic was devastatingly clear. She waited for him to explain. She gave him the space to explain because she believed even then that people deserved to say the thing they needed to say. He said things she would not later remember clearly. They blurred together in the particular way that words blur when the mind is doing something more important. He said there had been pressure. He said he had not planned it. He said Haerin meant nothing compared to what he and Amara had. He said he was going to handle it. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat very still with both hands flat on her knees the way she sat when she was processing something. And she looked at him, and she said, "Get out of this room." He got out. She sat alone in a room in a foreign country, pregnant, surrounded by people who had never wanted her there. And for the first time since London, she let herself feel the full size of what she was in. She had followed him into a world that was never going to accept her. She had carried his child in a house that had already decided the child didn't count. She had dismantled her own life, her research, her future, her sense of herself as someone with a path, and rebuilt it inside someone else's story. And somewhere in that same house, in a guest room she had been in twice and not thought about, his mother was making arrangements with a family that had been waiting, patient as stone, for exactly this moment. She didn't sleep. She made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a gesture, just a quiet, precise turning of the internal compass that had always guided her, pointing now toward the only direction that made sense. She was leaving, not tonight, She needed her passport, which was in the estate's safe. She needed money, not much, but some. She needed to know who, in this city of strangers, might help a pregnant woman get out of a compound with walls tall enough to keep the world from seeing what happened inside them. She started planning. She was still planning when, 3 days later, everything was taken out of her hands. The gathering was formal. It came with days of preparation, deliveries, the controlled chaos of a household mobilizing for something important. 200 guests, politicians, business executives, gang leaders in suits with faces that had learned to look legitimate. The kind of gathering where the room itself was a message. Amara dressed carefully that night. She chose not to disappear. She had been trying to disappear for months, trying to be small enough to move through this household without friction, and it had gotten her nowhere. She dressed in something that was hers, deep burgundy, her mother's gold earrings, the posture she had been born with, and she went downstairs. She saw Hayrin the moment she walked into the main hall. Standing near the center of the room, her hand resting on the slight curve of her own stomach. Visible, deliberate. Amara had approximately 4 seconds to understand what the evening was. She looked for Tae-hyun. Found him at the front of the room, near his mother, near the senior men whose names she had memorized and whose respect she had never received. He was looking at Hayrin. He was not looking at Amara. The room quieted with the specific efficiency of a room full of people who had been waiting for a signal. Lady Kong said something brief. Tae-hyun stepped forward. He took Hayrin's hand. He spoke to the room. She heard the words through a strange clarity, the Korean sharp and formal and public, about legacy, about the Kang name, about the child who would carry it forward. He placed Hayrin's hand on his arm. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you are announcing something. He did not look at Amara. When he did finally look at her, from across the room, 200 people between them, the moment already irreversible. What she saw in his face was not cruelty. That would have been easier. What she saw was something worse. Resignation. 2 men she had never spoken to appeared at her elbows. Not roughly, just present. Close enough. The kind of presence that was itself an instruction. The room was watching. She stood very still. She was 4 months pregnant and standing in a room full of people who had just been informed she did not exist, and she stood still with her mother's gold earrings catching the light and looked at the man who had told her he loved her in a kitchen in London and thought, not here, not in front of all of them, not with her face. She walked toward the door, her own choice, before the men at her elbows could make it otherwise. It was raining when she stepped outside. The estate's iron gates were ahead of her. The driveway lights were on. Behind her, 200 people continued their evening. She had no phone, no money, no passport. She was standing in the rain in a burgundy dress in a city that was not hers, carrying a child who had just been denied by his father before he had even entered the world. She walked to the gates and stood there in the downpour. Someone was eventually going to come to those gates. Someone was eventually going to open them or push her back or call a car or do something because the situation required resolution and situations always required resolution. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, standing there in the rain with rain running down the back of her neck and her shoes soaked through, was that the resolution would not come from inside that estate. It would not come from Tae-hyun. It would not come from the mother who had never wanted her, or the guests who had watched her walk out, or the men in suits who had stood at her elbows to make sure she went. It would come from somewhere else entirely. From a direction no one in that room was looking. But that was 20 years away. Right now she was standing in the rain, and the gates were closed, and the child she was carrying had no name yet. She put one hand on her stomach, pressed gently, felt the small life inside her that was the only thing in this city that was entirely hers. "We're leaving," she said quietly. To no one. To him. She didn't know yet where they were going. She only knew that wherever it was, it would be somewhere no one in that estate would ever be able to find them. She was right about that. She was right about almost nothing else that night, but she was right about that. The gates opened at 2:47 in the morning. Not for her. A delivery truck was leaving. Catering equipment, folded tables, the physical evidence of a party that had continued without her for hours. The driver didn't look at her. She was standing off to the side of the driveway in the dark, her dress soaked completely through, her shoes destroyed, and he looked straight ahead through his windshield and drove past her like she was a post. She walked through the gap before the gates swung shut. No one came after her. That was the part that stayed with her longer than anything else about that night. Not the humiliation, not the rain, not the 200 people who had watched her walk out. The part that lodged deepest was that no one came after her. Not a staff member with an umbrella. Not a driver with instructions to take her somewhere. Not Taehyun. Nothing. She walked for 40 minutes in the rain before she found a convenience store with lights still on. The young man behind the counter looked at her. The dress, the state of her, the particular kind of wet that meant she had been outside a long time, and said nothing, which was its own mercy. She stood in the warmth near the door and tried to think past the cold. She had no phone, no money, no passport. She was 4 months pregnant in a city where she knew approximately 6 people, none of whom she trusted enough to call, even if she'd had a way to call them. She thought about the Nigerian embassy. She thought about it practically. Location, hours, whether they would help or whether they would make calls that would send her back to the estate before she had a chance to disappear properly. She thought about the 2 academics she had briefly connected with at a conference 3 months ago, before Lady Kang's social engineering had quietly closed off most of her external contacts. She thought about the researcher at Yonsei University who had emailed her twice about a collaborative paper and whom she had been too busy surviving the household to respond to. She thought about her mother, 6,000 kilometers away, who did not know the shape of what her daughter was standing in. She did not think about Taehyun. She had finished thinking about Taehyun. That door had closed somewhere between the iron gates and the convenience store, and she had felt it close with a finality that was almost physical, a click somewhere in her chest, quiet and complete. The convenience store clerk eventually put a cup of hot tea on the counter in front of her without saying anything. She looked at it. She looked at him. He had gone back to his phone and was very deliberately not making eye contact. She drank the tea. By morning, she had a plan. Rough, dependent on several things going right that might not go right, but a plan. She had asked the clerk, in Korean that was better than anyone in the Kang household had ever acknowledged, to write down the address of the nearest Nigerian diplomatic mission. He had looked it up without comment and written it on a receipt. She walked there. It took an hour and 20 minutes. She arrived at the gates looking exactly like what she was, a woman who had been outside all night, and asked to speak to whoever was on duty. What happened next took 3 days and involved a series of conversations she would later be unable to fully reconstruct, conducted in a combination of exhaustion and a focused desperation that stripped everything down to the essential. The diplomat who finally sat across from her, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Okafor, who had the face of someone who had heard many difficult things and was not surprised by this one, listened to her without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're sure you want to leave the country?" he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "I'm sure I want to not be in that house." "Those are different things." "I know," she said. "Right now I need the second one. The first one can wait." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze without flinching because she had learned somewhere in the last year that flinching cost you things you couldn't always get back. "There are procedures," he said finally. "I understand procedures," she said. "Tell me what they are." What followed was not fast and was not simple, but it was moving, which was the only thing that mattered. Okafor worked quietly and without fanfare. She would understand later that he had almost certainly understood more about the Kong family than he'd let on, that the name had registered somewhere behind his careful, neutral expression, that the discretion he applied to her situation was not routine. He was careful. He moved things through channels she couldn't see. On the 4th day, he came to the small room where she had been staying and put her passport on the table. She stared at it. "You'll transit through Singapore," he said. "There's a woman there. Her name is Dr. Cho. She runs a women's health NGO. She's done this kind of facilitation before. She'll make sure you're comfortable until you decide where you're going next." Amara picked up the passport. It was real. It was hers. It was the entire physical proof that she existed outside of the Kang estate, that she had a country and a name and a government that was, in this moment, doing the minimum of what governments were supposed to do. Her eyes burned. She did not cry. She had not cried since the rain, and she was not going to start now, not in front of a man who had done her a kindness, not in a borrowed room in Seoul. "Thank you," she said. Okafor nodded once and left the room without ceremony, which was the right thing to do. She left Korea on a Tuesday morning on a flight that landed in Singapore 11 hours later. She had with her the clothes she had been wearing when she walked through the gate, 2 changes of clothes sourced from the embassy's discretionary fund, her passport, and a sealed envelope Okafor had pressed into her hands at the departure gate that she didn't open until she was on the plane. Inside was a handwritten note. 3 lines. Keep moving. You are not alone in this. The child you are carrying will need you whole. She folded it and put it in her passport. She looked out the window at the clouds for a long time. She thought about the convenience store clerk and his cup of tea. She thought about Okafor and his 3 lines. She thought about the way the world kept offering small, unexpected kindnesses in the middle of large, unfixable disasters. And she held on to that, not as comfort exactly, but as data. Evidence that the world was not exclusively the thing that had just happened to her. In Singapore, Dr. Cho was a small, precise woman who spoke 4 languages and ran her office like a field hospital. Everything functional, nothing wasted, the specific warmth of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by how badly people could treat each other and had redirected that energy into practical action. She asked Amara direct questions and received direct answers, and they understood each other immediately. Amara stayed in Singapore for 6 weeks. She slept. She ate. She saw a doctor and was told the baby was healthy and progressing normally, and she sat with that information in the clinic's small waiting room and felt something she couldn't name settle into her like ballast. The baby was healthy. Whatever else was true, this particular thing was true. She thought a great deal during those 6 weeks. Not about Tae-hyun. She was done thinking about Tae-hyun in the way you're done with something when you've processed it completely, when you've gone all the way through it and come out the other side. She thought about her mother, about Lagos, about what it would mean to go back, not as the woman who had left with a scholarship letter and 400 pounds, but as whatever she was now. She called her mother from Dr. Cho's office phone on a Wednesday afternoon. Her mother picked up on the second ring. Amara. Just her name. The way her mother said her name, like it was a complete sentence, like it contained everything that needed to be said, broke something open in her chest that had been sealed for a very long time. Mama, she said, and then she told her. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough that her mother understood and didn't ask questions and said, in the same voice she had used for every disaster and every triumph in Amara's entire life, come home. She flew into Lagos on a morning in April when the air was warm and thick and smelled like the city she had grown up in, and her mother was waiting outside arrivals with both arms already open before Amara had fully cleared the doors, and they stood there in the airport in each other's arms for a long time, her mother's hands moving over her back, her belly, her face. The inventory of a woman making sure her child was real and present and here. Her father was home. He had lost weight. He looked at her with his same closed-off face and said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "Sit down. You're eating before you tell me anything." She ate, she told them. Her father's face during the telling was the face of a man performing an extraordinary act of self-control. He asked no questions. When she finished, he sat for a very long time. Then he stood up and went outside. Her mother looked at where he had been sitting and said nothing. Through the window, Amara could see him standing in the yard with his back to the house, very still. He came back in 20 minutes later. His face had been reorganized. "Whoever this man is," he said, in the measured voice of someone who had decided not to use the words they originally wanted to use, "he will not be in this child's life unless the child one day chooses otherwise." "I know," Amara said. "Do you need anything?" "I need some time." He nodded. He sat back down. He picked up his tea and drank it with the same composure he brought to everything, and she understood that the conversation was over, that he had said everything he was going to say about it, and that what he had said was the most she could have asked for. She gave birth in July. A boy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She labored for 11 hours in her mother's house with a midwife and her mother and her cousin Adayeze, who held her hand and told her she was doing fine when it was clear she was not entirely doing fine, and who had the wisdom not to say anything more useful than that. When they put him in her arms, he was still making the particular furious face of someone who had just been subjected to something they didn't consent to, and she looked at him, this small, loud, furious person, and felt a love so immediate and so enormous it had no edges. She named him Elijah. She named him because she had chosen the name before he was born and had not consulted anyone about it, had not asked for opinions or invited discussion. It was the first purely autonomous decision she had made in 2 years, and she made it the way she made all her best decisions, completely, without hesitation, without leaving room for renegotiation. Elijah Adeyemi. He had his father's jaw. She noticed it immediately, that particular architecture of straight lines, and she looked at it and felt something complicated, not the grief she had expected, but something quieter and more durable, an acknowledgement. He was his father's son in ways she couldn't control and wouldn't pretend otherwise. But he was her son in the ways that were going to matter. She taught him that from the beginning. Not the lesson, not explicitly, but through the way she moved and worked and decided things in the world around him. She went back to her research. Not immediately. It took months to reestablish contacts, to find her way back into the academic network she had stepped away from, to rebuild the credibility that had sat idle while she was surviving Korea. But she went back. It was important that she went back. It was important that Elijah grew up watching her go back. She took a research position at the University of Lagos when he was 11 months old. She arranged childcare with the practical ferocity she brought to every logistical problem. She published. She went to conferences. She rebuilt the things she had nearly let the Kang household take from her piece by piece, with Elijah on her hip or in her mother's arms, or sitting on her office floor pulling books off the bottom shelf. She never talked about his father with hatred. She talked about him rarely, and when she did, when Elijah was old enough to notice the absence and ask questions that children ask, specific and undefended, she answered carefully. She said his father had been a complicated man who had made choices that hurt people, and that those choices were his, not Elijah's, and that Elijah owed his father nothing and could feel whatever he felt about him without having to perform either forgiveness or anger. She taught him Korean. That was the decision that cost her the most and that she never second-guessed. She taught it to him herself, starting before he was 2, because language was not the property of the people who had hurt her, and because she refused to let what Tae-hyun had done make a whole language into a wound. Elijah spoke Korean by age 5 with the clean precision of a child who had learned it as a native language. And when other adults heard him, they invariably looked surprised. And Amara never explained why, and Elijah never asked. He was a quiet boy, not withdrawn, precise. He asked questions and waited for complete answers and was unsatisfied by vague responses. He had her quality of measuring attention and the jaw she wouldn't have chosen to pass on. He was, by 12, the most financially literate person she knew, not because she had pushed him toward it, but because he had discovered mathematics the way some children discovered music and never fully surfaced from it. He was 14 when she told him the full truth. She sat him down at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with coffee, his first cup, which she had decided he was old enough for, and she told him everything. She told it without softening and without editorializing, as close to the plain sequence of events as she could get. She told it the way she would have told any important story, with respect for his ability to handle accurate information. He listened the way he listened to everything, still, absorbed, the coffee going cold in front of him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. His name, he said finally, Kang Tae-hyun. Yes. And the company is Kong Holdings. Yes. He nodded slowly, not with anger. She had been watching for anger, had been prepared for it. What she saw was something else, something that looked almost like calculation, but not cold, more like a student receiving a problem they intend to solve. Okay, he said. She studied him. That's all you have to say. Not all. He looked at her directly. Are you okay? She was startled by the question, in the way you're startled by something that comes from an unexpected direction. I'm fine, she said. You told me that story, he said, and you didn't look away from any part of it. That took something. She held his gaze and felt, not for the first time, the unsettling experience of being fully seen by her own child. I'm okay, she said, more carefully. I wanted you to have the truth. I know, he said. He picked up the cold coffee and drank it without commenting on the temperature. Thank you. She got sick when he was 16. It started as tiredness she attributed to overwork. She was carrying a full research schedule and had recently been shortlisted for a prestigious international grant. She was 41 years old and had been tired before. She was good at tired. Then there were other things. Pain that didn't resolve, weight that came off without trying, a shortness of breath on the stairs that she monitored carefully and said nothing about. The diagnosis was ovarian cancer. Stage 3. She told Elijah that same day. She did not soften it and she did not perform calm, but she was calm. Genuinely calm. The kind that comes not from suppressing what you feel, but from having thought about mortality long enough to have made some peace with its existence. He sat across the kitchen table from her, in the same chair he had sat in 2 years before, and this time his face did something it hadn't done then. Not tears. She almost wished it had been tears. It was something worse. It was the face of a boy trying to become what the situation required faster than he was ready to, which was a face she recognized because she had worn it herself. "What do we do?" he said. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "How bad is it?" What do we do? She loved him for that. She went through treatment. It was brutal in the specific way that treatment is. Systemic, unrelenting, demanding things from the body that the body resents deeply. She worked when she could. She let her mother help when she couldn't. Elijah managed the household with a competence that should have been impossible for a 16-year-old and wasn't, which was its own form of grief. The grief of watching your child learn to carry things too early because the situation has decided they have to. She had 2 years. They were not easy years, but they were real ones. She published 3 papers, saw Elijah accepted into a mathematics scholarship program in the UK, watched him leave and watched him come back for every school break with the particular intensity of someone trying to spend time well. She met his friends, she read his work, she argued with him about economics and epidemiology and the ethics of pharmaceutical pricing in low-income markets, and those arguments were some of the best hours of her life. She made him a box. It took her months to put together. She worked on it during treatment, in the hours she had that were functional, sorting through documents she had carried for 20 years. Not obsessively, not with the architecture of vengeance, but carefully. The evidence she had accumulated partly by accident and partly because she was the kind of person who held on to documentation. The articles about Kang Holdings she had saved without quite knowing why. The proof of her marriage to Tae Hyun, which she had managed to retrieve through Okafor's network years later. Medical records, photographs. She wrote the letter last. It took her several drafts and more time than she'd expected, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she kept finding the careful version of it, and she wanted it to be honest rather than just careful. She gave him the box on a Friday evening 3 months before the end. He sat across from her in the house that had been his whole world, and she put it on the table between them. "When you open this," she said, "it will be because I'm gone. Don't open it before." He looked at the box and then at her, his jaw, his father's jaw, his eyes, which were entirely his own. "Is it about him?" he said. "It's about you," she said. "He's in it because he's part of the story, but the story is yours." He put his hand on the box without opening it, held it there for a moment. "What do you want me to do with it?" he said. "I want you to become greater than the anger," she said. "Whatever you do with what's in there, I don't want it to be anger. Anger is how people lose themselves." "What if the anger is justified?" "It is," she said, "completely, and it still costs too much to spend." He looked at her for a long time. "I won't open it until," he said. "I know you won't," she said. She died in March, early, before the city had gotten warm, in the house where she had grown up, and come back to and made a life inside of. Her mother held one hand. Elijah held the other. The room was quiet. The window was open. She had been afraid in her worst moments that he would open the box with hatred in him, that what she had tried to build in him would not be enough against the weight of what she was leaving him with. She had been afraid of what the box might do if it found the wrong version of him. But she had watched him for 16 years. She had watched him build himself with the same materials she had given him: discipline, precision, the willingness to go all the way through a thing instead of around it. She had watched him become incrementally someone who understood that the most devastating thing you could do to a person who had wronged you was not to destroy them. It was to build something so extraordinary that the destruction happened as a consequence. She had done everything she could. The rest was his. The box stayed sealed for 2 years. sitting on the shelf in his room at his grandmother's house while he finished his undergraduate work at MIT on a full scholarship, while he spent his nights and early mornings learning things that had nothing to do with his coursework, the specific mechanics of financial markets, the architecture of shell corporations, the way money moved through legitimate and illegitimate systems, and how those systems could be turned on each other. He learned these things the way he learned everything, with complete absorption, without announcing himself, without letting anyone know what he was building. He opened the box on the morning of his 20th birthday, alone in his room with the door closed and the window facing east. He read everything, all of it, the documents, the photographs, the records, the evidence she had quietly accumulated across 2 decades of a life that had been shaped by one man's single catastrophic failure of character. He read her letter last. He sat with it for a long time after. Then he picked up his phone and made the first of 73 calls that would, over the course of the next 14 months, dismantle the Kong Empire from the inside out, with the precision of a man who had been preparing for this his entire life without ever admitting it to himself. He did not think about Tai Hyun while he made those calls. He thought about his mother at a kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, telling him the truth without looking away from any part of it. He thought about what she had asked him to become. He became something that didn't have a clean name, not a vigilante, not a criminal, not a businessman, exactly, though the tools he used were financial and the battlefield he chose was legal. The closest word was architect, someone who looks at an existing structure, understands precisely how it was built, and designs the specific sequence of removals that will bring it down without leaving fingerprints on the collapse. The 73 calls took 14 months. He made them from 3 different phones, none registered in his name. He made them from coffee shops and university libraries, and once from a park bench in Cambridge in November when the cold was serious enough that his breath fogged the screen. He made them in Korean and English and once in Mandarin to a financial journalist in Hong Kong who had been circling Kang Holdings for 2 years without enough to publish. He gave her enough. He was careful in the way that people are careful when they have thought about a thing for a very long time before doing it. He did not move fast. He did not move emotionally. He moved the way his mother had moved through everything, precisely, completely, without leaving loose ends behind him. The shell corporations came first. He had been building them since his second year at MIT, learning the architecture of financial invisibility from academic papers and court documents and the specific category of business school case study that examined how fraud worked from the inside. He built 12 companies across 7 jurisdictions: Cayman Islands, Singapore, Luxembourg, Delaware, the British Virgin Islands, each one holding a small position in Kang Holdings' publicly traded subsidiary. None large enough to trigger disclosure requirements, all pointed in the same direction. The fund he called Ghost, not for drama, because it was accurate, a presence that moved through the market without a body, without a name, without a face that anyone could photograph or subpoena. Ghost began acquiring Kang Holdings shares in the spring of his 19th year. Slowly, over months. The kind of accumulation that looks from the outside like institutional drift, pension funds rebalancing, index funds adjusting positions, the ordinary invisible movement of capital. No single transaction was large enough to notice. The aggregate was another matter entirely. While Ghost was buying, he was leaking. The evidence in his mother's box was old, but it was specific. Names, dates, transaction records, the kind of documentation that prosecutors loved because it was primary source material that had been sitting in a shoebox rather than manufactured for a case. He didn't send it directly. He sent it to a law professor at Seoul National University who specialized in organized crime legislation and who had published an editorial 3 years earlier arguing that Kang Holdings construction contracts contained structural irregularities consistent with bid rigging. He sent it through an encrypted channel using an anonymized account and included a note. "You were right about the construction contracts. Here is the rest of it." The professor took 6 weeks to verify what he'd received. Then she went to the prosecutors. The investigation that followed was not fast and was not clean, and was not the clean narrative arc that the word investigation implied. It was slow and bureaucratic and full of delays that Elijah tracked from Cambridge and Lagos, and eventually from a small apartment in Zurich where he had relocated for the access it gave him to European financial markets. There were moments when he thought it had stalled permanently. when a key prosecutor was reassigned, when a critical witness recanted, when Kang Holdings' legal team filed injunctions that pushed the timeline back by months. During those months, he did not panic. He adjusted. He found other angles, additional journalists, a former Kang Holdings executive who had been quietly let go 3 years earlier and who had, it turned out, kept records. A Korean-American congressman whose district included a significant Korean diaspora population and who was looking for a foreign corruption story that played well domestically. He fed each of them pieces, never the whole picture, never enough to trace back to a single source. The whole picture emerged from the accumulation, and the accumulation came from everywhere, and no one could point to the center of it because the center was a 20-year-old sitting in a Zurich apartment eating instant noodles and reading financial filings at 2 in the morning. Kang Tae-hyun was arrested on a Wednesday in October, 22 months after Elijah opened the box. Elijah was in a lecture hall in Zurich when it happened. He was auditing a course on international arbitration law, which he had decided was useful to understand and which had the secondary benefit of giving him a reason to be in Switzerland that didn't require explanation. His phone was off. He turned it on after the lecture and saw the notification from a Korean news alert he had set up 18 months earlier, and he read the headline twice. And then he put the phone in his pocket and walked out of the building into the cold October air. He stood on the street outside the university for 3 minutes. He thought about his mother. He thought about her at the kitchen table with the cold coffee. He thought about her hands in the last months, how they had looked different, lighter somehow, the way things look when the weight has been moving from them for a long time. He thought about the letter and the specific sentence he had read more times than he could count. I don't want it to be anger. Anger is how people lose themselves. He had not lost himself. He was still entirely himself, standing on a street in Zurich in October with the wind coming off the lake and his hands in his pockets, looking at a news alert that said the man who had denied him before he was born was in a detention facility in Seoul. He felt nothing dramatic. That was the truth of it, and he had always preferred truth to the version of himself he might have wanted to present. He felt something quieter and more complicated, a kind of settling, like a building that has been slightly off plumb for a long time, finally shifting onto its foundation. He went back to his apartment. He made coffee. He opened his laptop and began reading the full coverage. What he found, in the details of the arrest rather than the headline, was the first indication that something was wrong. The charges were significant but incomplete. Tax fraud, bid rigging on 3 specific construction contracts, money laundering through 2 of the subsidiary companies. All of it sourced from the documentation he had provided, but not all of the documentation he had provided. The deeper material, the evidence that touched the actual organized crime operations, the narcotics distribution network, the political bribes that went above the level of local corruption and into the offices of people who were still sitting in positions of power, none of that had made it into the charges. He read the filing 3 times. Then he pulled up the original documentation he had sent to the professor and compared it against what had been entered into the prosecution record. A third of it was missing. He sat with that for a long time. He was precise about what it meant. He did not catastrophize, and he did not minimize. He laid out the possibilities in order. The professor had not forwarded everything she received. The prosecutors had received everything and chosen to pursue only what they could prove quickly. Or something had reached into the process and removed the most dangerous material before it could be used. The first possibility he could investigate. The second was frustrating but not fatal. Incomplete justice was still justice, and Tae-hyun was still in a cell. The third possibility was the one that kept him awake. He sent a carefully worded message to an encrypted address he hadn't used in 4 months. He waited 48 hours. No response. He sent a second message through a different channel to the Hong Kong journalist who had published the first major story. She responded within 6 hours, and what she said was brief and specific. I've been warned off. My editor killed 2 follow-up pieces. I don't know who, but it came from above my editor. He sat in his apartment in Zurich and understood that the thing he had built, the careful, invisible, methodical architecture of Ghost and the shell corporations and the 73 calls, had accomplished part of what it was meant to accomplish, and had simultaneously revealed the edges of what it could not reach. There were people above Tae-hyun. He had known this abstractly. He had not fully accounted for what it meant in practice. that the criminal network his father had run was not a pyramid with Taehyun at the top. It was a web, and Taehyun was a significant node, but not the only one, and the other nodes were still operational and were now aware that someone had been pulling threads. They were looking for the thread puller. The call came 3 days later. He almost didn't answer. Unknown number, Seoul area code, and he had been rigorous about his communications protocols. But he answered because something in the particular timing of it, 3 days after the arrest, 2 days after the journalist's warning, felt deliberate in a way that required a response. Mr. Adeyemi. The voice was male, older, Korean-accented English spoken with the ease of someone who had used the language professionally for decades. Calm. The specific calm of someone who was not worried. Elijah said nothing. "I know you don't know my name," the voice continued. "That's fine. What matters is that I know yours. I know your mother's name. I know where she is buried. I know the scholarship that brought you to MIT was partially funded through a foundation that has connections to people who are currently very interested in understanding how Kang Tae-hyun came to be arrested." Elijah kept his breathing even, measured. He looked at the wall across from him and focused on a point on it the way his mother had once told him to focus on something fixed when everything else was moving. "What do you want?" he said. "To talk," the voice said, "in person, in Seoul. You have 72 hours to decide whether you're the kind of person who talks or the kind of person who makes things significantly worse for himself by not talking." The line went dead. He sat with the phone in his hand. His first instinct, the one that came before strategy, before calculation, the raw animal instinct, was to keep moving, get out of Zurich, change locations, go to ground. He was 20 years old and he had just been told, clearly and specifically, that people with resources and patience had identified him, and the particular phrasing of the call, "I know where she is buried," was not a threat he could categorize as empty. His second instinct was to understand exactly what had just happened. He had built Ghost to be invisible. He had been invisible for 22 months. Something had broken the invisibility, and he needed to know what before he did anything else, because acting on incomplete information was how the whole structure came apart. He spent the next 18 hours reconstructing every decision he had made in the last 6 months, looking for the point of exposure. He was methodical. He went back through every transaction, every communication, every contact, running the audit the way his mother had run experiments, with the specific discipline of someone who trusted process over intuition. He found it at 4 in the morning, the former executive, the one who had been quietly let go 3 years earlier, the one who had kept records. Elijah had made contact through an intermediary, a labor attorney who specialized in wrongful termination cases, and who had been, Elijah had believed, operating entirely in his own professional interest when he'd passed the executive's information along. The attorney had also, it turned out, represented Kang Holdings in 3 separate litigation matters over the preceding decade, a fact that was public record and that Elijah had not checked because he had been moving quickly at that point, because the executive's records had been too useful and the timeline too tight, and he had made the one mistake that his mother had warned him about without using those exact words. He had let urgency override rigor. He had been found through a man he had trusted because trusting him had been convenient. He closed his laptop. He had 72 hours and a choice that was not really a choice, not because he was afraid, but because the architecture of the situation had changed. Ghost was compromised. The shell corporations were potentially traceable. The people who had called him were not Tae-hyun's people. Tae-hyun was in a cell. They were the people above Tae-hyun, which meant they were people who had survived decades of exactly this kind of pressure and were still operational. He could run, disappear into a different identity, rebuild from scratch somewhere the name Adeyemi had no resonance. He had thought about this contingency. He had resources enough to do it, or he could go to Seoul. He thought about his mother's letter for a long time. Then he booked a flight. He landed at Incheon on a gray Thursday morning, 20 years after his mother had been walked out of an estate in the rain with no phone and no money, and no one coming after her. The city looked the same as it had in the photographs he had studied, the same dense horizon, the same particular quality of winter light. And he moved through the airport with his carry-on and his face composed into the neutral expression he had been practicing since he was 16, the one that gave away nothing. The meeting was in a private room in a building in Gangnam that presented as a wealth management firm and probably was one, at least partially. The man who had called him was older than the voice had suggested, mid-60s, compact, with the particular stillness of someone who had been in rooms like this for a very long time and had never once been the most nervous person in them. There were two other men in the room. Neither spoke. "You're younger than I expected," the man said. "You said you wanted to talk," Elijah said. He did not sit down until he was invited to, and he did not look at the other two men because looking at them was what they wanted him to do. "I did." The man studied him for a moment. "You've caused significant disruption." "The prosecutors caused the disruption. I provided information. Information that you obtained through methods that were themselves not entirely legal. I'd be happy to discuss that with the prosecutors." Something moved in the man's face. Not amusement, recognition. "You're not scared." "I'm very scared," Elijah said. "I'm just not going to perform it for you." The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he put a folder on the table between them and slid it across. Elijah looked at it without opening it. "Open it," the man said. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. Recent. The timestamp in the corner said 3 days ago. His grandmother's house in Lagos. The gate, the garden, the front door. And his grandmother herself, standing in the doorway with a neighbor, completely unaware she was being photographed. He looked at the photograph. He looked at it with the same fixed attention he had been using since the call, focused on something real and present and specific, not letting the edges of his vision go dark the way they wanted to, not letting the thing he felt move into his face. "This doesn't need to go further," the man said quietly. Taehyun made mistakes. He let things get personal when they should have stayed professional. We have no interest in continuing a conflict with a 20-year-old who was, at the end of the day, only doing what anyone in his position would have done. A pause. "What we need is the remaining documentation, the material that didn't reach the prosecutors. You have it. We want it. And if I give it to you, then this ends. You have the company. Kang Holdings is yours through the auction. You keep it. You run it however you want." We step back. No further contact. "And if I don't?" The man didn't answer immediately. He let the photograph on the table do the work. Elijah sat across from him and understood with complete clarity that he had walked into a room where the rules had changed. This was no longer the clean, invisible campaign he had designed. This was something older and more direct, and it operated according to principles his architecture had not been built to counter. He had the evidence the man wanted. It was on an encrypted drive in a safety deposit box in Singapore, the location of which existed in one place only, his own memory. He had been meticulous about that. He also had, in the inside pocket of his jacket, something the man did not know about. 3 weeks before the arrest, anticipating exactly this category of complication, he had made copies. Not copies he held, copies he had distributed to 4 separate locations, held by 4 separate people who did not know each other and did not know him by his real name, with instructions that were contingent on a specific signal that had not yet been sent. The man was asking him to hand over material he no longer solely controlled. He looked at the photograph of his grandmother's house. He thought about what his mother had said about anger, about cost, about the difference between what was justified and what was survivable. He made a decision. Not the one the man was expecting, not the one that ended things cleanly, the one that changed the shape of the game entirely, the one that required him to become something he had not been before, not the invisible architect, not the careful student with his phones and his shell corporations and his precise, unhurried timeline, something more visible, more direct, more dangerous to both of them. He looked up from the photograph and met the man's eyes. "I'll need 24 hours, he said. The man studied him. "For what?" "To consider my options." "You don't have options." "Everyone has options," Elijah said. "Some of them are just more expensive than others." He stood up without being dismissed. The 2 men along the wall shifted slightly. He did not look at them. He picked up the folder, closed it, and placed it back on the table in front of the man. 24 hours, he said. He walked out of the room. In the elevator going down, he pressed his back against the wall and breathed, deliberately, measured, counting the exhales the way his mother had taught him to manage the body when the mind needed to work. His hands were steady. He needed them to be steady for what came next. The 24 hours he had asked for were not for consideration. They were for a phone call to Singapore, 2 calls to Seoul, and 1 call to a number in Washington, D.C. that he had been holding in reserve for 14 months, like a last card in a hand he had hoped never to need to play. Because the man in that room had made one mistake. He had assumed that a 20-year-old who had built everything through patience and invisibility would, when finally cornered, revert to patience and invisibility. He did not know that Amar Adeyemi's son had been preparing for the moment the patience ran out since the morning he opened a box on his 20th birthday and read a letter from a woman who had taught him that the most devastating thing you could do to someone who had wronged you was not to. The call to Singapore took 4 minutes. He made it from a bathroom in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Gangnam building, standing at the sink with the tap running and his phone pressed hard against his ear, watching his own face in the mirror the way you watch something you need to stay accountable to. The man in Singapore was named Park. Not his real name. Elijah had never asked for his real name, and Park had never offered it, which was the basis of a working relationship that had functioned for 14 months on the principle that both parties understood exactly what they were to each other. Park was a financial forensics specialist who had spent 12 years working for the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit before deciding that the private sector paid considerably better. He was meticulous, expensive, and had no loyalty to anything except the specific transaction currently in progress. "I need the secondary distribution activated," Elijah said. A pause. All four simultaneously, 48 hours from now." Another pause, longer. "That's not reversible." "I know." "If you activate all 4 simultaneously, you lose the ability to negotiate with whatever you're holding against." "I know," Elijah said. "Activate them." He hung up. He turned the tap off. He looked at himself in the mirror for 3 seconds. The jaw, his father's jaw, the eyes that were entirely his own, and then he walked out. The second calls were to Seoul. 2 of them, made from different locations 20 minutes apart, to people he had cultivated for exactly this contingency. A junior prosecutor in the Special Investigations Unit who had reached out 18 months ago through an intermediary, fishing for information about Ghost, whom Elijah had strung along carefully, giving enough to maintain the relationship without giving enough to be traced, and a financial journalist at a different outlet from the Hong Kong contact, younger, less established, hungrier, without an editor yet compromised enough to kill a story on instruction from above. To the prosecutor he said, "The documentation you've been looking for will arrive through a verified channel in 48 hours. It will be complete. It will include material that goes above the level of Kang Tae-hyun. You'll want to have your team ready." To the journalist, he said, "I'm going to give you the story that ends careers. Not in pieces this time. All of it. 48 hours. You'll need to publish the moment you receive it, or it disappears." Both of them asked who he was. He didn't answer. The Washington call was the one that cost him something. The number belonged to a man named Reeves, a Senate staffer who worked on a subcommittee investigating foreign corruption and its intersections with U.S. financial markets. Elijah had identified him 2 years earlier as someone who had the institutional authority to make things move in ways that individual journalists and prosecutors couldn't, and had spent those 2 years feeding him small, verified pieces of information through a cutout, building the kind of credibility that made the next call possible. Reeves picked up on the third ring. "I need you to move on the financial network material," Elijah said. "Not the Kang Holdings subsidiary stuff. The network above it. The names I gave you in March. That's a significant ask. The timeline we discussed was..." The timeline changed. 48 hours. "Elijah." First time Reeves had used his name. That was information. "There are people on that list who have relationships with people on this committee. If I push this without adequate preparation, if you don't push it in 48 hours, the material goes to your competitors and you're explaining why you sat on it." Silence. 48 hours, Reeves said finally. His voice had changed. Resigned, maybe, or decided. "I'll need everything you have, not the curated version." "You'll have it." He hung up. He stood on the street outside the second coffee shop and felt the specific weight of what he had just done settle onto him. Not regret. He had thought about this sequence too many times to feel regret about deploying it. But weight. The weight of a thing that was now in motion and could not be stopped, that would arrive at its destination, whether or not he survived the next 24 hours, that had its own momentum now independent of him. He had made himself redundant. That was the design. The man in the Gangnam building believed Elijah held the remaining evidence and that eliminating Elijah eliminated the threat. He was wrong, but he didn't know he was wrong, and Elijah needed him to remain wrong for exactly 24 more hours. He went back to his hotel. He ordered food he barely tasted. He slept 4 hours, which was not enough and was all he could afford, and when he woke at 3 in the morning, he lay in the dark and ran the sequence again. Every step, every contact, every contingency he had built, and every one he hadn't, looking for the failure point. He found 2. Neither was fatal. Both required adjustment. At 6 in the morning, he was dressed and ready. He sent one final message through the encrypted channel. 4 words, a prearranged signal that meant the clock was running, and then he destroyed the phone. Physically, methodically, in the hotel bathroom, with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that convenience was how people got caught. He had one phone left, one identity left that wasn't compromised. And he had approximately 18 hours before the man in Gangnam expected an answer. He used 12 of those hours to do something the man in Gangnam could not have anticipated. He went to see Tae-hyun. The detention facility was on the eastern edge of the city, a modern structure that looked deliberately unremarkable, the kind of architecture that was designed to not call attention to what it contained. Getting in required paperwork that his attorney, a Korean-American lawyer named Shin, whom he had retained 3 weeks ago in a decision that had felt premature at the time and now felt exactly right, had filed that morning. Family visitation request, next of kin. The paperwork listed his mother's marriage certificate, his birth record, the documentation that proved in the specific legal language that detention facilities required that the man in the room was his father. He sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes. The room smelled like floor cleaner and recycled air. The chairs were plastic and slightly too small. A guard sat at a desk near the entrance, looking at something on a screen and not looking at Elijah, which was fine. Elijah sat with his hands on his knees and his back straight and his face doing exactly nothing, which was the single skill he had developed more than any other and which was, at this moment, costing him more than it ever had. Because he had planned this. He had thought about this moment for years, had written it in his mind and revised it and thought about every possible version of it. And now it was 20 minutes away and he felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt tired, not physically. He had been tired for months and had learned to work around it. This was different. This was the tiredness that comes from carrying a thing so long that you have forgotten what it felt like to not be carrying it, and the nearness of the moment when you might finally put it down was its own kind of exhaustion. A guard appeared at the inner door. Adeyemi. He stood up. He followed. The room they put him in was small and white and contained a table bolted to the floor and 2 chairs. A fluorescent light buzzed somewhere above a frosted panel. He sat in the chair facing the door and put his hands flat on the table and waited. The door opened 7 minutes later. Kang Tae-hyun walked in. He was 53 years old, and he had been in detention for 6 weeks, and he looked like both of those things simultaneously. He was thinner than the photographs Elijah had studied, the arrest photos, the court appearance photos, the corporate headshots from Kang Holdings' annual reports that Elijah had memorized without quite meaning to. The expensive suit was gone. The prison-issue clothing on a man who had spent decades wearing things that announced his power made him look smaller than his actual height. His hair had more gray in it than the most recent photograph showed. He walked in and looked at the young man sitting at the table and stopped. His face did the thing that faces do when they are trying to process something that doesn't fit any existing category. He looked at Elijah the way you look at something you almost recognize, the jaw first, then the eyes, then the jaw again. And Elijah watched the recognition trying to arrive and not quite getting there. Tae-hyun sat down slowly. They looked at each other across the bolted table. Elijah let the silence run. He was good at silence. His mother had been good at silence, and she had passed it to him. That specific capacity to not fill a space just because it was empty, to let a moment last as long as it needed to last. Tae-hyun spoke first. In Korean. "Who are you?" Elijah answered in Korean. Flawless, clean, the dialect of Seoul, the register of someone educated and deliberate and absolutely in control of the language. You don't know, Elijah said. It wasn't a question. I don't know you. No, Elijah said. You don't. He paused. My name is Elijah Adeyemi. My mother was Amara Adeyemi. She was a pharmaceutical researcher from Nigeria. She was your wife. You denied her and the child she was carrying in front of 200 people and had her removed from your estate in the rain. He said it without performance, without anger, without grief, without the weight he was actually carrying. He said it the way his mother would have said it, like the plain statement of a documented fact. Taehyun's face went through something Elijah watched with complete attention. Not because he needed the reaction, he had not come here for the reaction, but because his mother had deserved to be looked for in this man's face, and Elijah was going to do that for her. What he saw was not what he had expected. He had expected guilt. He had expected the defensive architecture of a man who had spent decades building justifications. He had expected, in some version of himself that was less disciplined, to see the face of someone who didn't fully remember, who had categorized and filed and moved on. What he saw was a man who had not moved on. The recognition, when it fully arrived, didn't rearrange Taehyun's face. It collapsed it. From the inside out, slowly, the way a structure collapses when the load-bearing element fails, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a terrible inevitability. His jaw tightened, his throat moved, his eyes, which had been doing the calculating thing that eyes do when they are trying to manage information, stopped calculating. He looked at Elijah, and he saw Amara. Elijah could see him seeing her, the specific quality of it, grief arriving in a body that had been trying to store it somewhere it wouldn't cause damage and had run out of places to store it. Taehyun started. She died, Elijah said, 2 years ago. Cancer. The word landed. Taehyun's hands, which had been flat on the table, moved. A small, involuntary movement, the fingers curling slightly. He stopped them. He was a man who had spent his life controlling his body in rooms like this, and even now, even with his face in pieces, his hands obeyed him. I didn't know, Taehyun said. I know you didn't. If I had, don't, Elijah said. Quiet. Absolute. Don't finish that sentence. Whatever you were going to say after if I had, don't say it. It changes nothing, and it costs both of us something. Taehyun went silent. I'm not here for an apology, Elijah said. I'm not here for money or acknowledgement or a conversation about what you should have done. I'm here because you're my father and she was my mother, and she deserved someone sitting across from you and saying her name in a room like this. So I'm saying it. He held Taehyun's gaze without blinking. Her name was Amara. She was brilliant. She rebuilt her entire life from the night you had her thrown out in the rain, and she raised me to be someone she was proud of. And she died with more dignity than anyone in your family will ever understand. The fluorescent light buzzed. Taehyun looked at his son. His son looked back. I'm sorry, Taehyun said. 2 words. No architecture around them, no justification attached to them, no negotiation embedded in them. Just the words, stripped of everything else, which was the most honest thing Elijah had ever heard from anyone who had a reason to say it. He sat with them for a moment. I know, he said. Then he said, I own the company now. Kang Holdings, what's left of it, is mine. I bought the controlling shares through the Geneva auction. I have the votes and the assets and the legal standing. Taehyun blinked, processing. Me. A pause. I'm going to dismantle everything illegal, cooperate fully with the prosecution. The evidence that goes above your level, the network, the politicians, the distribution operation, it goes to the prosecutors in approximately 32 hours. I'm telling you now not because I need your permission and not because I'm asking you to cooperate. I'm telling you because you're going to be offered deals in the next 72 hours, and some of them will come from people who will tell you they can protect you if you obstruct. They can't. And you should know that before they make the offer. Taehyun stared at him. You did all of this, he said slowly. The investigation, the leaks, the prosecution. Yes. You're 20 years old. Yes. Something moved across Taehyun's face that Elijah had no name for. Something that existed in the space between pride and devastation, between recognition and loss. He opened his mouth, and closed it. I have money, Taehyun said finally. Assets that aren't part of the formal estate. Hidden accounts. I can, if you need. I don't need your money, Elijah said. I have my own. The family name. You could take it. Kang. You have the right. I have my mother's name, Elijah said. I'll keep it. Taehyun's face did the collapsing thing again, more completely this time, and this time he didn't fully stop it. His jaw worked. His eyes went somewhere Elijah couldn't follow. He started. She was the best person I've ever known, Elijah said. She was also the best person you've ever known. You knew it then, and you made your choice anyway. That's yours to carry, not mine. He stood up. Taehyun looked up at him from the chair. His son standing over him, tall, composed, entirely present, and the power of the room had completely inverted without either of them raising their voice or moving aggressively, had shifted through the simple weight of truth spoken plainly by someone with nothing left to hide. Before you go, Taehyun said. His voice had changed, quieter. Something scraped out of it. Was she, at the end, was she? She wasn't alone, Elijah said. She was home. Her mother was there. I was there. He paused. She wasn't thinking about you. He said it without cruelty. Precisely. It was the truest kindness he knew how to offer. The plain fact of it, that she had died surrounded by people who loved her, that her last thoughts had not been of the man who had hurt her. He knocked on the door for the guard. He walked out of the room without looking back. In the corridor outside, with the door closing behind him and the guard leading him toward the exit, he felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatically, nothing cinematic about it, just a door closing quietly on something that had been open his entire life. The way a wound finally closes. Not painlessly, but completely. He had 12 hours left. He walked out of the facility into the Seoul afternoon. Cold, bright, the particular winter light he had seen in photographs his whole life. And he took out his last phone and made the call he had been saving for the moment after. It was answered on the second ring. It's done, he said. Tell them to move. The response was 2 words. He put the phone in his pocket. He had not eaten since morning. His hands were cold. He was 20 years old and he had just spoken to his father for the first and last time, and he was standing on a street in Seoul with 12 hours until everything he had built arrived at its destination. He found a restaurant 3 blocks from the facility, small, warm, the kind of place with plastic menu covers and a television mounted too high on the wall showing afternoon news. He sat down. He ordered soup and rice. The news on the television was covering the Kang Holdings prosecution with the particular breathless energy of a story that kept generating new developments. He ate. He did not watch the television. He thought about Geneva. The auction was in 48 hours. He had the votes. He had the capital. He had spent 20 months positioning Ghost's accumulated shares for this exact moment, the liquidation auction, where the remnants of Kang Holdings would be sold off to satisfy the court-ordered asset seizure. He was going to walk into that room and buy it. Not for revenge, not for the drama of it, though he understood the drama was real and didn't pretend otherwise. He was going to buy it because what he planned to do with it required ownership, and because what he planned to do with it was the thing his mother had described in her letter in terms that were not specific and that he had spent 2 years translating into a business plan. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, a message from an unknown number. Different from the Gangnam contact, different from anyone in his network. The message was 5 words. We need to meet. Tonight. He stared at the message. He had 12 hours. He had set 48 hours of machinery in motion that could not be stopped. He had walked out of a prison having said what needed to be said to the man who had denied his existence. He was 20 years old, and he had not slept properly in 4 days, and the soup in front of him was the first hot food he had eaten since Zurich. He should not meet an unknown contact tonight. He typed back, "Who are you?" The response came in under 10 seconds. "My name is Kang Jin-woo. I'm Taehyun's son, your half-brother. And the man who called you from the Gangnam building works for my mother's family. I've been watching what you've built for 6 months. I want to help you finish it. But you need to know what I know before tomorrow, or you walk into Geneva missing something that will cost you." He met Jin-woo at 11 o'clock at night in a pojangmacha near the Han River, one of the old canvas-covered street stalls that appeared after dark and disappeared before morning,
The kind of place where the light was orange and low and the smell of broth and charcoal made the cold feel less serious. Jin Woo had chosen it, which told Elijah something. A man trying to impress him would have chosen somewhere expensive. A man trying to intimidate him would have chosen somewhere private.
A man who wanted to have an honest conversation chose somewhere ordinary, somewhere with other people present, somewhere that required nothing of either of them except to sit down and talk.
Jin Woo was 26. He had his mother's features, the high cheekbones, the particular set of the eyes, and his father's height, and he was sitting at the far end of the stall with his hands wrapped around a cup of something hot when Elijah arrived. He looked up and did what Tae-hyun had done, looked at the jaw, the eyes, the jaw again, and then he looked away and looked back, and didn't try to hide that he was doing it. "You look like him," Jin Woo said. "I know," Elijah said. He sat down. "I look like him too." "I know that also." A beat of silence. The stall owner put a cup in front of Elijah without being asked. He wrapped his hands around it. "Your mother's family," Elijah said. "The man in Gangnam." "My uncle," Jin Woo said. "Seo Byung-chan. He runs what's left of the Seo network since my grandfather died." He turned the cup in his hands. "He doesn't know I'm here." "What does he know?" "He knows you didn't give him an answer today. He knows the 48 hours you asked for were not for consideration." Jin Woo looked at him directly. "He thinks you're preparing to run. And you know I'm not."
"I know what Ghost is," Jin Woo said. "I know what you built. I've been watching it for 6 months. Not because I was looking for you, because I was looking for whoever was dismantling my father's company and trying to understand whether they were going to dismantle me with it." He paused. "You're not running, you're accelerating." Elijah studied him. The same quality of attention his mother had taught him, the one that went past the surface into the structure. What he saw in Jin Woo was not an ally, not yet. What he saw was a man who had grown up inside a system he had not chosen and had developed a complicated relationship with that system, the way people do when they are both beneficiaries and prisoners of the same thing. "What do you want?" Elijah said. "I want Byung-chan neutralized," Jin Woo said. "Legally, permanently." He said it without drama, with the flat specificity of someone who had arrived at this conclusion through a process rather than an impulse. "My mother is not a bad person. She did what she was told to do her whole life, same as my father. Byung-chan is the one who built the leverage. He's the one who kept both of them in line. He's been running the CO side of this operation for 15 years, and my father was afraid of him. And I've been afraid of him my entire life. And I'm done." "How old were you when you found out what your father ran?" Jin Woo looked at the river, visible through the gap in the canvas where the cold came in. 8, maybe 9. It wasn't a conversation. It was just accumulation. The cars, the men. The way adults stopped talking when I walked into rooms. The way my father looked at certain people. He looked back. "How old were you?" 14, Elijah said. "My mother told me everything herself. At a kitchen table? On purpose." Jin Woo was quiet for a moment. Something in his face, not envy exactly. Something more complicated than envy. "She sounds like she was remarkable," he said. "She was," Elijah said. He said it simply, without weight, the way you say true things when you've had enough time with them. "What do you have on Byung-chan?" Jin Woo put his hand in his jacket and produced a phone. He placed it on the table between them, face down. "Everything," he said. "I've been building it for 3 years. Accounts, transactions, the specific operations he ran that my father didn't sanction. There were things Byung-chan was doing independently, using the Kong infrastructure as cover without my father's knowledge. Which is why Byung-chan needs the prosecution to stop at my father's level. If it goes further, his independent operations surface, and those connect to people who will take him apart themselves before any court gets to him." Elijah looked at the phone. "You've been sitting on this for 3 years, he said. "I've been waiting for someone who could actually use it," Jin Woo said. I don't have your resources. I don't have the network. I'm one person inside a family structure with a man who has every reason to make me disappear if he thinks I'm a problem." He pushed the phone an inch closer. "You do have the resources, and you're moving in 24 hours regardless. This makes it complete." Elijah picked up the phone. He looked at the screen. What he found there, in the 40 minutes he spent in that orange-lit stall while Jinwoo drank his tea and said nothing, was the answer to the question he had been asking since 4 in the morning in Zurich, the question of why the documentation reaching the prosecutors had been incomplete, why a third of his mother's evidence had disappeared from the record. Byung-chan had not just warned off journalists. He had a contact inside the prosecution team, a senior investigator who had been on the CO family's account for 7 years, and who had specifically redirected the evidence that touched Byung-chan's independent operations before it could be formally entered. The contact's name was in Jinwoo's files with transaction records attached. Elijah handed the phone back. "I need copies of all of it," he said. "I'll send them tonight." "And the contact inside the prosecution?" "Included." Elijah sat for a moment. He looked at this man across the table, his father's son, his mother's absence, the other side of a family he had been thinking of in terms of damage for his entire life. He felt something he had not anticipated feeling. Not warmth, not yet. Something more cautious than warmth. The beginning of a question. "After Geneva," Elijah said. "After this is over. What do you want?" Jinwoo looked at him. "Out," he said. "Completely out. New country if I need to be. I have no interest in what you're building. I'm not asking for a place in it. I just want the thing my family built to stop being the thing that defines what I am." "I understand that," Elijah said. He meant it. He meant it from a place in himself that had nothing to do with strategy. They sat for another few minutes in the orange light, with the river somewhere beyond the canvas and the city moving around them indifferently. Then Elijah stood up, and Jinwoo stood up, and they faced each other on the narrow strip of ground outside the stall with the cold coming off the water. "At the auction," Elijah said, "Byung-chan will have someone in the room." "Yes." "They'll be there to buy, to maintain control of whatever assets survive the liquidation." "Yes." "They won't succeed." Jinwoo looked at him for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think they will." They did not shake hands. They did not make promises. They separated into the sole night, going in different directions, each of them carrying the specific weight of what the next 24 hours required. Elijah walked for a while before he took a taxi. He needed the cold and the movement. He needed the city around him. This city that was half his by blood and completely foreign by everything else. To be real and physical and present, because what was coming required him to be entirely in his body and not in the version of events he had been running in his head for 2 years. The Geneva auction was at 7 in the evening, Central European time, which meant he had 16 hours to fly there, sleep, and walk into a room full of some of the most powerful financial actors on the continent and buy the wreckage of his father's empire in front of all of them. He slept on the plane. Properly. For the first time in days, with the specific surrender of someone whose body has finally made the decision for them. He woke over Central Asia with 4 hours left in the flight and ate and read through Jinwoo's files on his laptop with his seat reclined and the cabin dark around him and the focused, absorbed attention of a man reading something that required complete understanding. By the time the wheels touched down in Geneva, he had read everything twice. He sent the files to his attorney, to the journalist, to the prosecutor's office through a verified channel, specifically flagged with the name of the compromised investigator and the transaction records that prove the connection. He sent a separate, carefully worded communication to an oversight body within the Korean prosecution service that existed specifically to handle internal corruption allegations. He checked into his hotel. He showered. He put on the suit he had bought in Zurich 3 months ago and not worn yet, the one he had bought specifically for this day. Not to impress anyone, but because his mother had always believed that how you dressed for a moment told you something about how seriously you were taking it. He looked at himself in the hotel mirror. His father's jaw, his mother's eyes. The suit that was his own. He was ready. The auction room was everything the setting required it to be. A ballroom in a private Geneva institution, the kind of building that had been facilitating the movement of extraordinary wealth for over a century and had the architectural self-confidence that came with that history. 42 registered bidders. Legal representatives, investment bankers, several men who Elijah recognized from his research as fronts for entities that preferred not to appear in the room directly. He registered under his own name, Elijah Adeyemi. The registrar looked at the name, looked at him, looked back at the name. Whatever she was thinking, she processed his documents and gave him his bidder number, and that was the end of it. He found Byung-chan's representative immediately, a Korean lawyer in his 40s named Choi, whom Elijah recognized from 3 photographs in Jin-woo's files, sitting in the 3rd row with the contained expression of someone who expected to win and was managing that expectation carefully. Choi saw Elijah looking at him, held the look for a moment, looked away. The auction began at 7:12. What followed was 45 minutes of financial theater that Elijah had been preparing for with the specific intensity he had brought to every component of this project. The assets were divided into lots: the legitimate real estate holdings, the manufacturing subsidiaries, the pharmaceutical division, the construction arm, the financial services company. Each lot drew bids from multiple parties. Elijah bid on all of them, not aggressively, not theatrically, with the measured, consistent presence of someone who had decided the outcome in advance and was simply executing the decision. He had the capital. Ghost had been building toward this for 22 months. The accumulated shares and the cash position assembled specifically for this liquidation event. He had the legal standing. His attorney had filed the necessary documentation 48 hours ago. Choi bid against him on the first 3 lots, escalating, probing, testing the ceiling. Elijah did not have a ceiling, and after the 3rd lot, Choi seemed to understand that. And on the 4th lot, he paused before bidding, and on the 5th lot, he put his paddle down and did not raise it again. The whole room felt the change. The auctioneer moved through the remaining lots with increasing efficiency. There were other bidders, some genuine, some not, but none with the combination of capital and preparation that Elijah had brought. At 8:47, he purchased the final controlling interest in what had been Kang Holdings' pharmaceutical division, and the auctioneer closed the bidding. And the room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quiet that follows the end of something that everyone present understood was significant. He put his paddle down on the table in front of him. He did not look triumphant. He did not perform anything. He sat with his hands flat on the table and breathed, in, out, counted, the way his mother had taught him. Then he stood up, reached into his jacket, and produced a photograph. He placed it on the table. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. The room, curious, began to quiet further. He waited until the quiet was complete. "The woman in this photograph was my mother," he said. He spoke in English clearly, without raising his voice, in a room built for exactly this kind of acoustics. Her name was Amara Adeyemi. She was a pharmaceutical researcher from Nigeria who came to London on a scholarship and built a life from nothing twice over. 20 years ago, she was removed from an estate in Seoul with no money, no phone, and no passport, 4 months pregnant, by the man who had promised to love her. He looked up at this room, at 42 faces doing various things in response to what they were hearing. That man built this company. Tonight, his son owns it. He picked up the photograph. "I wanted you to know why," he said. He sat back down. The room stayed quiet for another moment, and then did what rooms of financial professionals do: returned to its business, to the paperwork and the handshakes and the logistics of what had just been transacted. But it returned to it differently, at an altered angle, with the specific atmosphere of people who have just been made to understand that what they witnessed was not purely a business transaction. Choi left the room without speaking to anyone. Elijah watched him go and felt nothing particular. Byung-chan's attempt to control the assets had failed. The 48-hour clock had run down. The documentation was in prosecutors' hands. The journalist's story was publishing in the morning. The Senate staffer in Washington had moved on the financial network material. Byung-chan was going to spend the next several weeks discovering that the architecture he had counted on had been systematically removed from under him, and there was nothing he could do about it from the outside of a process that was already in motion. Elijah's attorney appeared at his elbow. "We should discuss the transition timeline." "Tomorrow," Elijah said. "Tonight I need to sleep." He slept for 11 hours. He woke to 17 missed calls, 412 new emails, and a news alert informing him that a major Korean publication had published a story overnight about the Kang Holdings prosecution expanding to include a senior SEO family figure connected to evidence tampering in the ongoing criminal investigation. He read the story. He made coffee. He sat at the hotel room desk and drank it and looked out the window at Geneva, the lake, the clean, cold light, the Alps in the distance being what they had always been, indifferent and permanent and enormous. He thought about his mother drinking coffee in Lagos, about the particular sound she made, a small exhale, satisfied, when she took the first sip of the morning. He had heard that sound his whole childhood and had not known, until she was gone, that he had memorized it. He thought about her hands. He thought about the letter. Then he opened his laptop and began the work. The dismantling of Kang Holdings' criminal operations took 8 months. It was not dramatic work. It was the opposite of dramatic, consisting largely of documentation, legal filings, meetings with prosecutors and compliance officers, and regulators in 3 countries, the patient and meticulous process of separating what was real from what had been constructed to obscure the real. He cooperated fully. He opened every file, answered every question, provided every record he held. He handed over the names, the accounts, the operational structure, the entire architecture of what his father had built. Former mafia leaders, corrupt politicians, senior executives who had known and enabled, they went down in sequence, some quickly and some slowly, the legal process moving at its own pace and largely without his involvement once he had provided the foundation for it. He focused his energy on what he was building. The transformation of the pharmaceutical division took longer. He hired people who were better at it than he was, which was a discipline he had learned from his mother, the discipline of knowing where your expertise ended and someone else's began. He brought in researchers, development teams, manufacturing specialists, regulatory experts. He rebuilt the division's research agenda from the ground up, prioritizing the therapeutic areas that had been deprioritized under Kang Holdings because they were not sufficiently profitable. Neglected diseases, treatments for conditions that disproportionately affected populations in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, the specific category of medicine that existed at the intersection of high need and low commercial incentive. He renamed the division on a Tuesday morning in February in a meeting room in Seoul with 8 people present, with no press and no ceremony. He changed the name in the legal registration documents. He changed it on the building directory. He ordered new letterhead, Amara Life Sciences. He sat with the name on the registration document for a long time before he signed it. The first major research initiative was the one that had been most important to him from the beginning, an affordable ovarian cancer treatment designed for healthcare systems in low-resource environments. Not a donation, not a charity initiative, a pharmaceutical product priced and packaged and distributed for markets that the industry had systematically ignored because profit margins were thin. It took 3 years to develop. The clinical trials ran across 5 countries. He attended the final trial readout in Nairobi, sitting in a conference room with researchers his mother would have respected, precise, rigorous, arguing productively with each other over data, and watched the results come in. Effective. Safe. Producible at a cost point that made distribution viable. He sat in that conference room in Nairobi and looked at the numbers on the screen and felt something that had no clean name, not triumph, not vindication, not the completion of a transaction, something older and quieter. The specific feeling of something that was always going to exist finally existing. He called his grandmother from the hotel that night. She was 81, and her voice on the phone was the same as it had always been, direct, warm, slightly impatient with sentiment. "You sound tired," she said. "I'm always tired," he said. "Your mother was always tired too," she said. "She worked too hard. You're the same." A pause. "Are you eating?" "Yes." "Properly." "Relatively." She made a sound that communicated clearly what she thought of relatively. Then she said, "She would be proud of you. I want you to know that. Not because you built a company or bought something, because of how you did it." He held the phone. "I know," he said. "Come home," she said. "Not forever, just for a while. My garden needs help." He went home for 2 weeks in March. He helped with the garden. He visited old neighbors, ate the food his grandmother made with the specific authority of someone who had been making it for 60 years, slept in the room that had been his growing up with the window open to the smell of the city. He let Lagos be loud in the personal way that it was loud, pressing on him, knowing him, requiring something, and he found that he had enough of himself left to meet the requirement. He visited his mother's grave on the last morning. The cemetery was on the eastern edge of the city, in a neighborhood she had known. Her headstone was simple, Her name, her dates, the phrase she had asked for, which was not a quote from anything, and not a sentiment, but just a fact. She built what she was given into what it should have been. He brought yellow flowers. He had always brought yellow flowers, though he couldn't have said precisely when that had started. It felt like a decision that had made itself, the way some of the most important decisions did. He sat on the ground in front of the headstone for a long time. The morning was warm. The city was doing what it always did. He told her about Nairobi, about the trial results, about the specific number, 17,000 women in the first distribution year expected to have access to treatment they would not have otherwise had. He told her about the building in Seoul with her name on it, which still surprised him slightly every time he approached it, which he suspected would continue to surprise him, and which he had decided was appropriate, that he should not become comfortable with it, that the slight surprise was a way of continuing to see it. He told her about Jin Woo, who had relocated to Vancouver and was working for an environmental consulting firm, and had sent Elijah a short email 6 months after Geneva that said only, "I'm okay. Thank you." He had responded with 2 words, "Me too." He told her about Tae Hyun, who had received a sentence of 11 years and was serving it in the facility on the eastern edge of Seoul. Elijah had not visited again. He did not plan to. But he had done one thing. Through his attorney, quietly, without announcement, he had arranged for Tae Hyun to have access to books. A standing order, renewed quarterly, from a bookshop in Seoul. Whatever Tae Hyun wanted to read. No message attached, no expectation of acknowledgement. It was not forgiveness. He had thought carefully about what it was, and the most accurate word he had found was acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that Tae Hyun was a person who had made catastrophic choices, and who was still, in the end, a person. The books were for that, not for the man who had denied him, for the person who remained after you took the choices away. He sat in the warm morning and looked at his mother's name. He was 24 years old. He owned a company that employed 11,000 people. He had coordinates in 3 cities and a grandmother who wanted him to come home more. He was tired in ways he was still learning to manage and accomplished in ways he was still learning not to be dismissive of. He was his mother's son, precisely in the specific way she had intended, and he was his father's son in the ways that he had learned to carry without either denying them or being defined by them. He was not a mafia boss. He had never been a mafia boss. The press had called him that. The youngest Korean mafia boss ever to dismantle a criminal empire, which was the kind of headline that was technically inaccurate and emotionally true, and which he had decided not to fight because fighting it required energy he needed for other things. What he was harder to name. The closest he had come was this: someone who had been handed damage and had decided that damage was information, not destiny. Someone who had taken the thing that was meant to define him, the abandonment, the denial, the rain outside iron gates, and had turned it into the energy for something else. Not despite the pain of it. Through the pain of it, using it as fuel the way his mother had used it, which was the most important inheritance she had left him. The flowers were yellow in the warm light. He put his hand flat on the ground in front of the headstone for a moment. "I did what you asked," he said. He wasn't sure if it was entirely true. He had done some of what she asked. He had become greater than the anger, mostly. He had built rather than only destroyed. He had made the choice, in the moments when the choice was real and costly, to spend his energy on what could be created rather than on the satisfaction of watching what had wronged him burn. But he had also, he was honest enough to admit, wanted to watch it burn. That had been real too. The anger had been real, and he had spent it, and it had cost him something, and he had done it anyway, and his mother's letter had said anger was how people lost themselves, and he had spent it without losing himself, which he thought might be the most human version of what she had asked for. Not the absence of anger, but the survival of it. He stood up. He brushed the dry grass from his knees. He picked up the paper the flowers had come wrapped in. He looked at her name one more time. "Amara Adeyemi," he said. Out loud in the warm morning, in the city where she had been born, and where she had come back to, and where she had made a life and made him and made everything that had followed. He said her name because she deserved to be named. In the air, in the light, by her son, who was standing on his own feet in the world she had prepared him for. Then he walked back through the cemetery to the gate, and through the gate to the street, and into the city that was loud in the personal way, pressing on him, knowing him, and he let it press. He had work to do. He had always had work to do. He went and did it.